She's a Democratic member of the Maryland House of Delegates. She represents District 20. Her professional work experience includes being a governor affairs advisor at Kirkpatrick and Lockhart, Preston, Gates, and Ellis. And she was also a director of domestic policy to the United States Senator John Kerry, a legislative director to U.S. Representative Joseph Kennedy II. She was appointed by President Obama to the Executive Committee of the DNC and to a White House advisory group on health reform. During 2004 presidential campaign, Delegate Mizeur was the key architect of Senator John Kerry's health care and disabilities platform and served as the Maryland State Director for the Kerry Edwards campaign. Welcome, Delegate Mizeur.
Thank you very much. Thank you for bringing us together to have this conversation today, particularly surrounding and around the conversation of the Ball State Report, because we know that we are going to improve our opportunities to be more successful when we look at things from a systemic, larger picture view and how all of these parts work together. You can't just look at the tax climate. You can't just look at our productivity and innovation. You can't just look at our human capital. This is a systems approach. And it gives us an opportunity to review and have a dialogue about where within this system can we boost up and do better, and how can we help Maryland come forward in a really roaring and stronger way. You've asked us to share vision today, and I'm excited to do that, but before I do, I want to make it very clear that there is nothing a politician can do in this state that will create a job. What we can do is create an environment in which you, entrepreneurs, can be successful in creating jobs and being successful. I'm a small business owner. I'm the only one on the Democratic side who has private sector job creation experience. I know what it's like to create jobs and meet payroll and what that challenge is. And I also know what the opportunities are and how Maryland can come forward better to help us be more successful in doing that. One of the things that we have to get a lot better at is improving our regulatory environment. I started to look into a couple of years ago, why don't we do more composting in this state? It was a personal interest of mine from an environmental perspective, but it also seemed to me that there was a huge job opportunity here. Each one of us creates 700 pounds of compostable material that goes into a landfill that could be diverted, and the work to do that diversion creates jobs. But when you went to talk to the large industrial commercial composting facilities around the country and ask them why they weren't locating in Maryland, they said, it's too confusing. I don't know how to be successful in Maryland. I don't know what the rules of engagement are. Businesses want certainty more than anything else. And in order to be successful, we need to know how to operate in this state. And you have a Department of the Environment, a Department of Ag, and Natural Resources that have all defined what composting is, how we deal with it, how we treat it, how we overturn it, what are the rules and regulations, all of which were conflicting. And so we're just not going to operate in Maryland. And that's why we didn't have any residential curbside pickup in our state. So I brought together a group of stakeholders over a course of a year to untangle that mess, bring the private sector to the table with the agency heads and advocates for improving our composting policy in the state, and generate consensus on how we can rewrite these rules and create new roadmaps and pathways to progress on this particular issue. We passed new legislation that untangled that mess, and as a result, a private report came out about 2 months ago saying that we're on our way to generating 1,400 new composting jobs in Maryland over the next 3 to 5 years. There is opportunity for us across the board to dig in and drive consensus on how to make the work we're doing in the government better create opportunities for pathways for success for our private sector entrepreneurs. We also have an opportunity to improve. It's not just that we are best in the nation for our research and development dollars. We know that there's a huge lag on commercialization. We have a lot of thinkers in this state, and we've not done enough to connect us to our builders. There's no reason why we should be #1 in R&D and 37th in commercialization. Now, we've started to try to improve over the last couple of years how we can do that by putting site miners and entrepreneurial researchers in our institutions to better connect and create interdisciplinary teams of clinicians and engineers and lawyers and business owners to come together and say, here's how we take these ideas into the marketplace. Here's how we allow for improved tech transfer and not have everything get stopped at the university wall, but bring it into the marketplace. And then when we're going to start investing more dollars in that, having more site miners, I think, is an important priority. We need to have a conversation about making sure that as we are investing significant state dollars through our Maryland Innovation Initiative, through the University of Maryland Venture Partnerships, that we are having tied to that an expectation that more of that work gets done and produced in Maryland. That we're not just bringing these ideas to a marketplace to be manufactured someplace else, that we're bringing them here to be manufactured in Maryland. Some of the conversation earlier today hit on a point that I talk a lot about, which is the importance of creating and developing cluster approaches to what we can succeed and thrive on here in Maryland. Whether it's, and we've already shown how good we are at doing it on cybersecurity and health sciences, healthcare, green economy jobs. The opportunity that we've brought by having a focus on offshore wind is creating an opportunity not just to create jobs here in Maryland, but to be the first state in the country that figures out how to do this right, creating a market-based niche industry for, as we know, the entire eastern seaboard is going to start following suit. Why shouldn't it be Maryland that is manufacturing these parts and products for the green economy jobs that we are creating here? One of the places where I feel that we could definitely improve in a cluster, if you want to get down into specifics, is on nanotechnology and nanobiotechnology. I partnered with Senate President Miller to bring forward a program a few years ago that put significant investments in nanotechnology, and there's more that we can do to grow that. We know that we sit in the cluster of what is our own research triangle, but we haven't done a very good job of coordinating it as such. We have Johns Hopkins, we have the universities of Shady Grove, we have College Park, but within that we have all of our federal assets that we can partner with and collaborate better. NIH, FDA, the cancer labs in Frederick, a wealth of ingenuity and opportunity there, that when we talk about the nanotech sector, we already have $2 trillion worth of product that is nano-based in our economy already. It's in our cosmetics, it's in our, what do you call it, when you're waxing your car, it's in, I mean, there's probably not a product in your household that doesn't contain some form of a nanotechnology product and benefit, and yet we're not driving that innovation from Maryland the way we could because of our connector to those federal assets. And during the question and answer section, I would be delighted to go into some more detail about that. There's a huge gap in this state between the jobs that we have available and the workforce that you need to perform the jobs. And we have to close that gap. We're not thinking in terms of 5, 10, 20 years down the road in aligning our market-based job opportunities with our curriculum in our schools to make sure that we are graduating students with the skills necessary to go into your field of work. I hear from employers all the time, I have jobs. This isn't a jobs problem. I don't have a workforce ready to do the jobs. And if we are able to step up in Maryland to better align those opportunities, I think we're going to see a greater ability to make sure that we have more than a 1% manufacturing increase in Maryland's future. And to close, early childhood education has to be a part of that. Part of the big problem, we can't just address it on the back end. We have to address it on the front end. We know time and time again that when we invest in early childhood education, it helps eliminate the achievement gap that we talk about. That John Pepper, the former CEO of Procter & Gamble, said that the return on investments makes early childhood education be what we call in the business community a no-brainer. And we know that for every $1 invested in early childhood education, we benefit $7 on the back end. And by addressing 0 to 5 early childhood needs in a comprehensive way in Maryland, we can eliminate the socioeconomic, gender, and race-based achievement gap that exists that creates so much of our trouble on the back end and is part of what is hamstringing us in terms of having the workforce for the 21st century economy that we are trying to create here on your behalf. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today to dialogue about these issues. I'm looking forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Delegate Mizeur. I have 2 questions. The first one is about, again, the taxes. In that Washington Post article, you did not provide what you thought was a rational tax base for corporate and on individuals, which, again, is how most Maryland manufacturers pay taxes. And the second question is, are you in favor of supporting the exploitation of the natural gas resources we have in Western Maryland?
Thank you. Specific to the question you asked earlier about S-Corp and LLC taxes for business owners, I know exactly what you mean because I have been caught in that crosshair as well. It's incredibly frustrating when you are forced to pay taxes every year on the entire amount of income earned when what you're really trying to do is build a stable pot of reserves that will protect your workers during tough economic times that you can ride out when there's a downshift in the economy. But you are forced by our tax code right now to claim that income entirely as your own every year and pay taxes on it. And I'd like to restructure it so that you are only paying taxes on that money when you are drawing it down to use either as your own payment for your own income that you're going to report on your taxes or that you're expending it on your business. But you shouldn't be forced to claim that entire pot of money every year as income for you and your personal income, because then you don't have a reserve that you can turn to. The reserve became for me when the economy hit the downturn and I started to lose revenue. For me, what it was that I didn't pay myself a salary for 2 years. And that was in part okay because I was forced to pay myself so much in previous years that I could weather that storm. I had to go through my own sort of back-ended calculations on, okay, the tax code's forcing me to take this money, pay it out in taxes now. I have to live in a particular frugal way to reserve that money on my own personal side so that if necessary moving forward, if I don't pay myself an income, then that money can be used to pay my employees. But why should we be having to go through those kind of pretzel calisthenics, right? We need a tax code that actually will support our businesses to be able to do that. On the question of natural gas, I have been very much a strong proponent of assuring that Maryland does this differently than every other state. Every other state in the union rushed in and started to drill first and ask questions later, sometimes to very unfortunate consequences. It is not hyperbole that there are communities in Pennsylvania throughout that state that lost access to their entire water supplies because of the leak of the methane gas that made their water unusable. It is not a myth that entire groups of agricultural entities surrounding certain drilling areas in West Virginia had their livestock die from exposure to some of the toxic chemicals that were coming out of the wells, or that there's been increased seismic activity in Ohio that has stopped this level of drilling. Now, I've never said that that means Maryland shouldn't drill. It just means that Maryland has to hold the oil and gas industry accountable for how we do this differently in Maryland. That we don't want to rush in and allow for drilling that will then result in disastrous consequences for public health, the environment, or the local economy. Let's keep in mind when we're talking about the economy that in Western Maryland and Garrett and Allegheny counties, the #1 industry is tourism, ecotourism, and second home industry. And if you are rushing to do something that will harm that industry, people go there to swim in Deep Creek Lake. They go there to hike the Allegheny Passageway and to kayak on the Youghiogheny River. And if that starts to shift, that's going to be a huge economic downturn for that region. The jobs that have been created in every other state that has done this has been more driven jobs for workers imported up from Texas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma. And I've said all along that if we push Maryland to do this right, if we get up to a place of determining how this can be done differently, we need to make sure that those are jobs for Maryland workers and that the only benefit doesn't end up being the hotel industry that's housing out-of-state employers. And along the way, by holding the industry accountable and forcing a different method, it's not impossible to think, I mean, this is America, right? We know how to innovate. We know how to do things differently when we hold that accountability. How about an opportunity where we could be a leader in manufacturing and working on some of the green alternatives to doing this? It doesn't have to be the toxic chemical cocktail that the companies are using right now. There's an opportunity to come up with a greener approach to do this, and why shouldn't Maryland be one of the leading states out there pushing for the opportunity to create new jobs and doing this in a different way? But if we don't figure out how to do it safely, yes, I will be willing to have the conversation about making sure we don't do it. Because I don't think anybody in here is saying, let's drill and not worry about whether or not we ruin our water supply, or let's drill and not worry about whether or not we increase earthquakes in our area. We have to make sure that we get this one right.
Morning. You gave an example around the composting where there were multiple and conflicting regulations, definitions, and it was hard. It just really kept people from wanting to do business here. The question I had was, and I think we all have experienced the multiple and conflicting requirements that can be out there. One of the things we always look at, though, too, is as a manufacturer, it can be tough to know where you even have to look because there are so many different organizations, departments, and agencies that can provide regulation. So can you speak to not only trying to pull folks together after the fact and say, okay, now how do we make sense of it? How do we get so that doesn't happen? What are what are your thoughts around being able to make sure that, one, it's streamlined, we have what we need, but we don't have more than we need in the way of regulations coming down the pipe?
Yeah. I've been working to try to get, the challenge with this is that we have not gotten to a place where there seems to be any consensus on what are our top 10 biggest frustrations on the regulatory side. I've reached out to folks at the Greater Baltimore Committee and a number of the chambers in the state, and you get a lot of different answers about how we go about doing this. And so in the last legislative session, I had proposed a task force. I'm typically not a huge fan of task force activity in the state because it's sometimes a lot of much ado about nothing and creates a report that sits on a shelf. Although I think properly driven with the right oversight on it, it actually can produce great results. That composting fix that I talked about came from a task force that I pulled together and was devoted to doing this. And I wanted to bring that same kind of focus to a task force on creating answers and consensus on how to improve Maryland's business climate. And it started getting bipartisan sign up, and I had a range of supporters on both sides of the aisle on this, and the Speaker of the House came forward and said, we don't need that bill, I'm going to put an advisory group together, a special advisory group. And so we didn't push the legislation in the last session. I think some of what came out of the Speaker's advisory group was helpful in pinpointing some of this, but it wasn't what the big picture of what we need. And I think at the end of the day, this can't just be driven by a legislative task force. This is something that has to be driven by the governor. This has to come from the top down across all agencies with an engagement from the bottom up. And I have been, throughout my career in 8 years in Annapolis, everything I have gotten done, from expanding health insurance to uninsured children and low-income women, family planning services, the investments in nanotechnology jobs, these all have come from bringing people together, regardless of party, and having a conversation about what what is possible, how are we going to move the ball forward. So we need to come together and drive consensus, and I'm willing and focused on having that conversation, and then having that gut level instinct, get it done approach. You know, there are some people who run for governor because they want the job, and there are some people who run for governor because they want to do the job. And I have always been a doer. My entire career shows that I know how to get in and fix problems, and that's why I'm doing this. And so all of these things that have been ignored for way too long requires executive leadership, and I'm the one to provide it.
You had spoken earlier about commercialization and site mining. Very familiar with this. In terms of taking this and creating an industrial ecosystem, if you will, within Maryland, an industrial entrepreneurial ecosystem, what thoughts do you have to be able to do that beyond just site mining?
Well, could you clarify for me what you mean by, could you ask the question one more different way so I
Sure.
have a better sense?
Sure. We have all these great innovations, kind of like you were talking earlier about green tech, some of the things that are within our either federal labs, university R&D centers, and other. And site miners take them and bring them strategically out, either to large companies, medium, or small, if you will. We have an opportunity to create an industrial entrepreneurial system here, cluster, if you will. Any thoughts about how that can be developed?
So much of this, it's sort of a no-brainer in many ways. It really is about collaboration and about attention to setting a vision and being able to follow through on it and getting consensus on what that is. Like, I can offer up some of my own visions on how we do this. It doesn't necessarily mean that everyone here thinks it's going to be the best approach, but I think it's about setting that agenda, being visionary. If I can just dig into the nanotech thing, for example, part of what is so exciting about nanotech is that it's got all of this untold promise, but there's also this unknown risk associated with it, right? We've learned that because we can see things at the nanoscale, that there's an HIV virus. The HIV virus actually connects to you with a claw. And so we have scientists that are now trying to figure out how to disable that claw so it doesn't attach. We used to, or still, treat cancer by filling up the body with poison and hoping that we kill the cancer before we kill the patient. But now we're able to coat cancer clustering materials with a particular kind of material that you could just zap individual cancer cells. We might get to a place in our lifetimes where chemotherapy is gone. That's the untold promise about nano that is so exciting and that we want to be a part of. But I'm in the visionary side of things, thinking through, there's also unknown risk. And we're standing at a precipice where the questions about the impact of nanoparticles in our food supply, getting into our lung membranes, what it means for our long-term health, if we don't get out in front of determining how to do that safely as well, there could be a huge ramification in the economy if there's a consumer pushback about nanoparticles being in our economic supply. And so why shouldn't Maryland try to partner with the federal government in proposing a nanoparticle characterization center where we use all this brain power in this state and all the innovation and ingenuity around us to have conversations about cataloging and understanding how various nanoparticles work in the body for good and bad, and get out in front of the conversations necessary to make sure that we don't have a backlash against the nano industry moving forward. That, setting a center like that creates a footprint for how you then bring all of the other manufacturers, all of the federal assets that I discussed before together to be focused on something, and that is how you create a regional powerhouse, is by being innovative not only about the jobs we can create, but how we can be out in front of the advancements and the protection of an industry like this. And that's just one idea. Take it or leave it, but I think what it gives you is an example of how do you think outside of the box? How do you look down the road about what we do in Maryland to truly shake things up, be innovative, bring things to the table, have the conversations from leveraging multiple sources in order to be able to truly impact the environment and bring our scorecard up from all of these various indicators that we've been discussing today?
Thank you. Thank you very
Thank
much,
you.
Delegate Mizeur. We appreciate it.